Okay, so welcome everyone. So for those of you who are new to the Spitzer School, my name is Marta Gutman. I'm the Dean of this great School of Architecture, the premier public school of architecture in New York City. And yes, you can clap, students. And tonight, I'm delighted to welcome you to the annual Mumford Lecture, made possible by the Spitzer Architecture Fund. So as is our wont, I'll begin by acknowledging that the Spitzer School of Architecture, grounded on the schist bedrock outcrop of Harlem, is situated upon the ancestral homeland and territory of the Munsee, Lenape, Wappinger, and Quasitic peoples. As members of an educational community, we are obliged to grow and thrive on the histories of dispossession that have allowed the great City College of New York to grow and thrive on a vibrant terrain. As designers and thinkers, we are endeavored to build in ways that lead toward justice, and we are committed to working to dismantling the ongoing consequences of settler colonialism. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to welcome the president of City College, Vince Boudreau, to the podium to say a few words of welcome. Thank you, Vince.
Thank you, Marta, and thank you all for being here tonight. You know, one of the things I love about the Spitzer School is as an architecture school, how deeply embedded the study of architecture in this place is in political processes. And spending a little bit of time earlier this week over in the exhibition next door, it was striking to me and explicit in Kasim's work how the flexibility of the built environment necessitated the flexibility of the regulatory framework and political framework and the ability of builders and people who will live in buildings to work together. And I've thought a little bit in this last year about how improvisationally we've been living in the last, certainly because of the pandemic. But I also think coming out of the pandemic, the habit or the willingness to re-examine, to be flexible, to reconsider fixed structures has benefited us, has sunk in. And so I'm really thrilled to have this talk here this evening. The Mumford Lecture is a long, well-established, beautiful tradition, a gift that the Spitzer School gives every year to the rest of the college community, to New York's community. And so my main job is to welcome all of you here and to tell you that this is an important event in the college's calendar, and then to get out of the way. So I'll do that now. Thank you and welcome.
So just to say, thank you, Vince, as always, silver-tongued and wonderful words. So yes, this lecture is imagined and is constructed as the culminating event to the series of events that we've offered here at Spitzer in conjunction with the great exhibit that's just outside the auditorium. Mass supports that our own very welcome, wonderful, distinguished lecturer, Kasim Shepard, has organized. So for those of you who it's also really wonderful to see so many people. Thank you for being here. Really appreciate it. So before I introduce our speaker, I'd just like to share a word or two about the Mumford Lecture for those of you for whom it may be a new experience. So each spring, the Spitzer School of Architecture and its urban design program, headed by Julio Salcedo. Where are you, Julio? See, this is why we like being here. We like being in person. We love cheers. Okay, terrific. Present the Lewis Mumford Lecture. Named for the writer, architecture critic, and urbanist Lewis Mumford, who attended City College, the series invites the world's most distinguished urbanists to speak freely and publicly about the future of cities and the social purposes of architecture, in keeping with, of course, the exhibit that is just outside the door. This series was initiated by the late Michael Sorkin, distinguished professor of architecture and director of the urban design program at the Spitzer School, and curated by him for 11 years. And as the new dean of the Spitzer School of Architecture, it's been my honor and privilege to reignite this series and to bring it to life with a new group of speakers. So, and Emily Badger being one of them. So I just I'm a dean and my boss is right there. So in honor of Michael and this lecture, we at Spitzer are looking to endow the Michael Sorkin Visiting Distinguished Lecturer position. And please, I would appreciate if you would reach out to me for any information, and always happy to chat always about Michael and all that he did for our great school. And there's an info sheet here about the position that we're seeking to endow if you would like some more information. So now to the topic at hand. Emily Badger is a staff writer with the New York Times covering cities and urban policy. She is particularly interested in housing, transportation, and inequality, and how they are all connected. Prior to joining the Times in 2016, she wrote for the Washington Post and the Atlantic Cities, now known as CityLab. She grew up in Chicago, a city that has shaped a lot of her thinking about these topics, and today she lives and writes from Washington, D.C. So I've admired Emily's reporting for years, and I was honored to meet you, Emily, when you reached out last fall regarding research, regarding my research. I hope I found a soulmate, I have to say. A journalist committed to scrupulous research, interested in history, and committed to figuring out answers to the housing crisis that plagues us all. So there are snippets in Emily's recent stories, whatever happened to the starter home. And so you want to turn an office building into a home, which is what we'll hear about today a bit, or snippets of what I would call our exchanges in those wonderful, wonderful stories. So the title of Emily's talk is Pressing Change in an Increasingly Inflexible Series. And I think without any further ado, rather than summarize the talk you're about to hear, I just ask you to join me in welcoming Emily Badger to the Spitzer School and the Mumford Lecture.
Hello. Thank you all so much for being here and for having me. Can you hear me okay? Am I standing close enough to this? Yeah. Sorry, let me just pull up my notes. So I really want to thank everybody for coming tonight, and I want to thank Marta in particular for thinking of me in the same breath as Lewis Mumford. It's kind of a big deal if you're a writer. And to be thought of in the company of Rebecca Solnit and Jane Jacobs and Mike Davis. These are writers who I've tremendously admired. The architect Yasmin Lari, who gave this talk last year. It's really an honor, and I'm especially grateful to be not doing this over Zoom, to be doing it actually in the room with you all. This is much more enjoyable for me. When Marta and I first talked about my doing this many months ago, she asked me to send her a title for my talk. And I thought, generally, that's not how we do it in journalism. We don't write the headline before the story. And we definitely don't do that like 5 months before the deadline arrives. But I sent her something that I thought sounded sort of academic, maybe, and something that left me some wiggle room to figure out what I wanted to say. But I knew that I wanted to try to articulate something that has been nagging at me over the course of my reporting in the last year in particular. And that is this recurring sense that has come up in my conversations with lots of different kinds of sources, with builders, planners, home buyers, renters, architects, economists, historians, all kinds of people, that we have lost the flexibility we need in our urban fabric and our urban policy to adapt in the face of major changes today. And I'm thinking of challenges like an aging population that needs different kinds of housing stock, an increasingly acute housing affordability and homelessness crisis, climate change, potentially durable declines in transit usage, downtown office demand, brick and mortar retail. These are each seismic shifts, all happening at the same time. And they mean that we have to adapt how we use land and buildings and public space. The pandemic made clear that this adaptation requires us to basically turn lots of things into other things. So I'm thinking of turning offices into housing, turning our own homes into workspaces, turning hotels into SROs, turning parking spaces into dedicated bus or bike lanes, turning sidewalks into restaurants, or turning empty malls into mixed-use communities. But there's such a tangle of rules and forces built up over decades that makes it difficult in many cases in many cities to do that. Now, you may remember that there was a time early in the pandemic when urbanists across the country were really thrilled that it suddenly felt like we can do big and fast things. We can close streets to cars, we can turn empty hotels into homeless shelters and redesign bus service to prioritize essential workers. Cities were throwing up miles of bike lanes overnight. They were fast-tracking outdoor dining programs. And there was something incredibly hopeful about that early in the pandemic, even in the context of this terrible public health tragedy. But we did all of those things under a state of emergency. And then we undid a lot of it. And now, 3 years later, we're back to a lot of the politics and policymaking as usual pre-pandemic style. I'm thinking of having endless fights over incremental housing reforms in state legislatures, or doing nothing in state legislatures at all, or arguing over who has a right to certain very specific parking spaces, or whether the rules should allow our neighbors to have an accessory dwelling unit or not. And as I've thought more over the last few months about this tension between the changes that we need on one hand and the flexibility that we lack on the other, I've realized, as is usually the case for me, that I've only quite figured out what I want to say when I have a little bit better sense of what the headline looks like. So now I'm going to give you an alternate title for this talk, or think of it more as like a subhead. And I stuck it in New York Times Cheltenham typeface because I thought that that would also help me figure out what I was trying to say. So the city should be flexible by design, but we've designed the flexibility out of it. And when I say that last part, I mean that we've done that somewhat intentionally. In some cases, the inflexibility is a side effect of other goals we were pursuing. In other cases, the inflexibility is the point. The whole purpose of single-family zoning or large lot minimum lot sizes is to be extremely inflexible about what people can build, right? So let me pause here to say that I don't write very much explicitly about architecture and design. I just want to be upfront about that. I'm not an architecture critic. The Times has a wonderful one in Michael Kimmelman. But I write a lot about the rules which are effectively invisible to most people that shape most of what we build. I'm talking about zoning rules that ensure that vast stretches of land in most American cities cannot have any kind of housing on them other than a detached single-family home. This is a project that my colleague Kwok Trung Bui and I published a few years ago, trying to make that fact visible to people. Or I'm interested in parking requirement rules that say, for example, that any newly constructed apartment building must have 1.7 parking spaces per 2-bedroom apartment. It doesn't matter if the people living in those apartments are unlikely to own cars. It doesn't matter that forcing the construction of an expensive underground parking structure is going to raise the rents on everybody in the building and completely change the economic structure of the project. These are the rules that we have. Most zoning codes have a crazy table in them somewhere that looks sort of like this, prescribing parking requirements in minute detail for every imaginable building use. This is a very tiny portion of the table in the San Jose, California city zoning code. That's a city that's actually trying to reform its parking minimums at the moment. There's not enough space on this slide for me to show you all of them, but there are different parking requirements for veterinary clinics, pawn shops, dry cleaners, crematories. In San Jose, if you're selling general merchandise, you need one parking space for every 200 square feet of floor area. But if you're selling furniture, you need one parking space for every 250 square feet of floor area. But if you're selling appliances, you need one for every 1,000 square feet. And I can just picture the people who wrote this rule worrying about the relative space taken up by sporting goods compared to couches, compared to washing machines. And that's a question that seems really loosely connected, if at all, to city building and city planning. But we do massive amounts of rulemaking of this kind. I'm also particularly interested in the rules that dictate the building material you must use in a home, where exactly the garage must be located on it, the architectural features it must have, what else you're allowed to put on which parts of the lot. I went looking for some good examples of these very prescriptive kinds of housing requirements and rules in the Huntington Beach, California zoning code. And I'm picking on them because they're a particularly big offender of state laws in California that are trying to increase housing supply there. But I found this great diagram for you. I know that New Yorkers are familiar with the concept of a setback. This is a rock formation setback for your garden in Huntington Beach, California, which is such an intimate level of detail to bother writing a rule about, but somebody did that, and there's tons of other rules just like that. So anywhere you look, rules like these are at play. But the public often mistakes them for the work of the free market or the mark of consumer preference. People think, oh, we've mostly built single-family homes because that's what everyone wants. Or developers only build luxury housing because that's what's most profitable to them. But if you're someone who does work primarily in architecture or design, you have to understand these rules too, because they constrain and shape what you're able to do. What you would like to create may not be what you're allowed to create. And on any given project, you have to work within not just the constraints of your parcel of land, the constraints of engineering, the constraints of economics, but also the constraints of public policy. And what I would like to argue here is that this last set of constraints has grown more numerous, more complex, and often more convoluted over time. So now, just as we've arrived at this moment where we need to rethink many aspects of the built environment, we're working with zoning rules, building codes, state mandates, and public processes that make it really difficult to do that. I was talking about this project with a New York developer earlier this year, and he said this great line that has stuck with me. He said, oh, I have a name for the buildup of that stuff. I call it the kludge. And kludge, I think, is this kind of wonderful word for what I'm talking about. It describes this kind of cobbling together of ill-fitting parts that weren't originally designed to solve a problem together. And I think that that sounds like a pretty fair description of the accumulation of the kind of rules and constraints that I'm talking about. In many cities, new rules have been added over time and nobody ever took the old ones out. We're still living with rules that were originally designed to keep poor people away from wealthier ones and to racially segregate neighborhoods. We've added important new social goals to our public policy, like protecting the environment. But people have also found ways to warp those goals in service of blocking change. We've added new forms of process and public participation that we know are wielded disproportionately by older white homeowners to maintain communities as they want them to look. We know that that's who comes to a 7 p.m. public hearing on a school night to say no to a new mixed income housing development. We've also added new pressures to our processes of city building. In America today, housing is the primary means of wealth creation for many families. We expect our homes to appreciate indefinitely. We expect them to fund our retirement, to send our kids to college, to provide an inheritance to future generations. But we didn't think about housing that way in America 70 years ago, 80 years ago. Thinking about it that way today, though, forces people and politicians and state legislators to act in defense of property values, which often means fending off anything new that people fear might lower them. What all of this adds up to is communities that are increasingly prescriptive about what can be built, and increasingly inflexible in allowing something new or different or experimental or previously unseen, or even just the kinds of things that we used to regularly build in cities decades ago. The response to this that I'm suggesting isn't that we should say anything goes, deregulate the city. But we have to strike a better balance between protecting health and safety and managing externalities in dense environments on the one hand, and on the other hand, allowing room for new forms and uses to emerge as our needs change. So if all of a sudden it turns out we need big 1970s era office buildings to become something else, we need to make it easier to reimagine them. If we're trying to be creative about solving homelessness, we need to be able to revive old ideas like single room occupancy hotels. If we need to reduce carbon emissions, we have to be able to more easily convert roads that have for decades been used primarily by cars into priority bus lanes. To be a little less abstract about this, I want to share in greater detail some examples of how these constraints work and how they're currently preventing us from achieving some of the adaptations that we know we need. I am basically in my reporting these days collecting examples of this kind of stuff. So if you happen to have your own really good examples of kludge, I would love it if you would tell me about them, email me, send them to me. We've done a lot of reporting at the Times lately on converting office buildings into housing. This is a topic that's very much in the air in New York, but also in cities all over the country. And when you start drilling into how that actually works, of course, many of the constraints are about the physical characteristics of office buildings, but a lot of them are also about public policy too. This building is, that I'm showing you right here, this is 180 Water Street in the financial district. And my amazing colleague, Larry Buchanan, who is hiding in the back of the room, made these illustrations of it. This building is actually an example of a successful conversion. It was turned into apartments in 2017, and it's a fascinating illustration of how to do that because the architect and the developers did something that sounds really crazy. They cut a 1,200 square foot hole out of the center of a 25-story building so that they could bring some windows and light into the interior facing apartments. And then the developers also used that hole to recapture the building's economically useless space. They basically took the floor area they cut out of the building, which they were legally entitled to redevelop, and they repackaged it into floors they added onto the building's roof. So imagine taking a 700 square foot apartment with no windows that no one wants to live in, and being able to turn it into a 700 square foot rooftop apartment that has beautiful light and city views and lots of people live in it. That's basically what they did with this building. And it's kind of a wild solution to the awkwardness of converting this building, which was big and bulky and has all of this dark interior space that translates incredibly poorly to apartment living. And the developers and architects were able to come up with the solution to it because they were given an unusual amount of flexibility by the city to figure out how to do that. And I'll explain how they did that in a minute. This is an aerial view of 180 Water Street. And one of the things that I love about this building is that if you were just walking by it on the street, you would never know it has this giant hole cut out of the center of it. It's sort of like this little secret that you only know about if you've been inside of it. But if you like to lurk on Google satellite imagery, like I do, you're in on the secret. You can see the courtyard from the top of the building. The building that I'm showing you next to it, 160 Water Street, is now undergoing conversion to with a similarly crazy process led by the architecture firm Gensler. They are conceptually removing unusable, unrentable interior space from the building and repurposing it into space for new buildings, new floors that they're adding to the top of the building. And in both of these cases, the developers were able to do this because in the 1990s, New York relaxed a number of constraints on older office buildings in the financial district, specifically with the goal of spurring more office conversions into apartment buildings. one of those changes said, if you have an older building, if it was built before 1977, you can ignore the floor area ratios we normally impose on residential apartment buildings in New York. Never mind the FAR cap of 12, this standard that restricts residential buildings to something smaller than many giant spec-built offices constructed in the 1960s onward. Under these relaxed rules, if you're converting an old office, you can just take the entire building and turn it into housing. 100% of it can be turned into housing. And this totally changes the economics and viability of projects for developers, because they don't want to convert a 30-story office building if they're only allowed to make 20 floors of it apartments, right? Now, the same developers involved in both of these buildings I've just described, 180 Water and 160 Water, also thought about trying to convert this third building across the street, 175 Water Street. This is a sad former AIG headquarters. But guess what? It was built in 1983. So it's not eligible for these more flexible rules. And the developers concluded that it didn't make sense for them to try to do it. There's, of course, nothing special about the year 1977, but it's a standard that made sense when this rule was established in the 1990s, and we still live with it today. So the city's conversion task force, the mayor, the governor, all proposed moving that cutoff date that applies to creating more flexible rules for conversion, moving it from 1977 in the financial district, 1961 in other parts of the city, to something much more recent, so that many more buildings might have access to these more flexible rules. And doing just that one little thing, moving that date, would have gone a long way toward reintroducing flexibility in the built environment as opposed to reducing it. But this is one of the housing proposals that's now languished in the state legislature. So there are a million other little examples like this, and they vary by city, where we've said an office should be this, it should be shaped this way, it should have these features and these rules apply to it. And then we said a residential building is a totally different thing. It should be governed a different way. It should have a different number of parking spaces. It should have different seismic requirements. And by doing that, we've now made it nearly impossible to turn an office into an apartment, even setting aside all of the physical characteristics that make that challenging. Perhaps an even better example of these strict use distinctions that don't totally make sense today is with hotels. Theoretically, they should be easier than offices to convert to housing, right? Because they're already a form of shelter. And we have a whole history in America of treating hotels as part of our housing stock, of having this spectrum of housing options that includes hotels, boarding rooms, rooming houses, SROs, apartments. But over time, we've come up with all of these rules that say, actually, hotels aren't housing, and they should be treated with a different set of standards. And lo and behold, that makes it difficult to turn them into housing today. Ingrid Ellen at NYU and Noah Katzis at the University of Michigan have done a lot of work looking at the obstacles to conversion, both with offices and hotels. And they've both been extremely helpful in giving me a lot of their time in my trying to understand this topic. And they made this point in one of their shared papers on the topic that I wanted to share. Across an array of regulatory spaces, contemporary law tends to distinguish between short-term and long-term residential uses, hotels and apartments. And it's not clear that this is supporting good housing policy. The sharp divide between short-term and long-term residential uses is an ahistorical one. It's an inflexibility that we've added along the way that we didn't used to have. Ellen and Katzis give a great illustration of this in New York today. In New York, a hotel is supposed to have a 20-foot rear yard. A residential building is supposed to have a 30-foot rear yard. And so that basically means if you want to convert the one into the other, you have to figure out what to do with the back 10 feet of the building that have now made it non-conforming. Similar to the office conversions I showed you above, there are some buildings that have exceptions to these rules, but even the exceptions are incredibly complicated, and they depend on where in the city the building is and how old it is. You may also recall that the legislature passed a bill in 2021. It was called the Housing Our Neighbors with Dignity Act. creating up to 100 million to help facilitate converting hotels into permanently affordable housing. But that bill didn't ease any of these rules or create new flexibility to make that possible. And there's no amount of money that we can throw at conversions that really matters if we're not also pairing it with policy change. A lesson that I think is often lost on how we think about creating policy for this. So now I'm going to show you some housing at a totally different scale, which Marta will recognize. This is a little workers' cottage in West Oakland, dating to around 1875. And I'm borrowing it from the work of Paul Grove, who is actually the one whose work introduced me to Marta.
I did the field work. I measured those buildings.
She measured this building. Okay, well, let me tell you about Marta's work. I love this charming diagram on the right here. And what it's showing you is that this little building in 1875 was built as like a 2-bedroom cottage for an Irish family of 4. And then various owners over time added on a rear kitchen, a sleeping porch, turned the sleeping porch into something permanent, took that apart, rebuilt it, added a new wing with new bedrooms. Basically, multiple generations of families iterated on this house depending on their family's needs. And then at one point, a family lifted up the entire thing and put a rental apartment underneath it. None of that would be allowed today. I'm talking about both some of the specific changes I just mentioned, but also just the general flexibility that allowed prior generations to adapt their homes as their personal circumstances and the circumstances of the economy changed. If you were a family during the pandemic and you needed to quickly enclose a porch to make yourself a home office, or you needed to convert your garage into somewhere where your adult children could move in with you, in many places you can't do that. We know that many people do these things anyway. They do it informally, but most communities explicitly prohibit the kind of inflexibility that we're looking at here. In Washington, D.C., where I live, sometimes I watch these hyper-local neighborhood level Zoom zoning meetings, and I think about this diagram because it's a totally normal occurrence in these public meetings that I like to watch, that some poor homeowner shows up with their architect in hand, and they're begging for permission to do something like fill in the tiny dog leg on a 100-year-old row home so that they can put a pantry and a powder room on the first floor of their house. And the neighbors frequently say no, often for sort of abstract sense that we should be maintaining the integrity of the original footprint of these 100-year-old rows. And this kills me because if you know anything about our housing stock that we built in America 100 years ago, the people who built it did not intend for it to remain perfectly unchanged, but we've sort of convinced ourselves over time that that is a goal in and of itself, sort of protecting things from change, protecting that building from changing. And those kinds of neighborhood meetings, by the way, are themselves another example of the constraints that we've had. The people who attend them often are not even binding decision makers, but actual policymakers defer to them as representing the voice of the community. And in that way, what we've effectively done is given more people a veto over how we change things in the city and created even more constraints. So I'm going to give you one more example that's not about housing. In this timeline where we're layering new and novel constraints on the built environment, we add a lot of new environmental protections in the 1970s. And these are important. They do a tremendous amount of good. But over time, people also figure out that the environmental review process is a great way to bog down or block projects you don't like for reasons that have absolutely nothing to do with environmental protection. What I'm showing you here is a bike lane on Howard Street in San Francisco. I picked it only because I used to regularly commute in this bike lane. But San Francisco, for years, got stalled implementing a bike infrastructure plan because the city was sued under the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, by someone arguing that painted bike lanes and bike racks constitute changes to the environment that require an extensive environmental review. This legal case dragged on for years, during which the city did not paint bike lanes or install bike racks because they were afraid of the ongoing legal proceeding. And ultimately, the city produced an environmental assessment that was like 1,300 pages long. The city ultimately prevailed in the end, but this kind of thing is not uncommon in California in particular. Opponents citing CEQA to block the very infrastructure projects that we know reduce car dependency. Bike lanes, carpooling lanes, transit priority projects. Here again, the inflexibility is the point. We have devoted roads to cars exclusively for such a long time, and many people don't want that to change. They don't want to be flexible about that. In California, the state legislature has tried to crack down on this by specifically exempting sustainable transportation projects from environmental review. And what they're essentially trying to do there is to claw back some flexibility for cities to redesign roads and public infrastructure, something that will be essential to battle climate change. Now, there's no single way to measure over time the declining flexibility that emerges from all of this, because it's created out of many different processes and they all interact with each other. But I've also been trying to hunt for useful metrics that capture this declining flexibility over time. One obvious one, we know that zoning codes have grown longer over time, if we want to count them by pages. The 1916 New York City zoning code, does anybody know roughly how long that was? 20 pages. 20 pages? I suppose it depends in part on how you want to print it out on your own printer, but it's in the range of like 14 pages or a little bit more than that. 14 pages was also the original Euclid, Ohio zoning code that prompted the landmark Supreme Court case upholding zoning. Today, by contrast, zoning codes in major cities, including New York, run several thousands of pages, including all of their tables and appendices. It's also true that environmental impact statements under the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, those have grown if we want to measure them in total pages or in the amount of time it takes to complete them. And we know that the amount of time it takes for new housing to be approved has generally grown also. Another thing that we can do is measure the effects of this declining flexibility. This chart shows the share of all new single-family housing in America that we might think of as a starter home. So roughly 1,400 square feet in size or less. I know this sounds giant to people in New York, but I'm talking about this in a national context. This is such a dramatic chart, the way it just dwindles over time from the vast majority of the housing we used to build to almost none of it. And part of the reason why this has happened is because we've grown wealthier as a nation. We can buy more housing per person. The housing that we build now is more likely to be out in the suburbs where there's more land, you can build bigger housing. But there's something else that's going on here too. And that's also that we've added a bunch of rules for home builders that say things like, your parcel must be at least 1/4 of an acre in size, or no house can be smaller than 1,800 square feet, or every house must have at least a 2-car garage. And the more rules that we create that force housing to be bigger and higher end, the harder it becomes to build smaller, affordable homes. And again, often that's the point. If you're creative enough in the restrictions you put on new construction, you can ensure that no one builds modestly priced housing in your community. You don't have to come out and say, we don't want modestly priced housing in our community. You can just say your house has to have a 3-car garage attached to it. This last chart also gets at one other important point about what happens when we layer so many constraints on what can be built. The range of things that gets produced within those constraints is really narrow. All of those homeowners who can't build starter homes anymore, or duplexes, or bungalow courts, or even row homes, they wind up building similar large detached single-family homes with a great big garage out front. Or developers build very similar 5/1 apartment buildings that have giant retail spaces on the ground floor that only a national chain would move into. Or in the office conversions that do happen, they wind up serving only the same tight economic niche at the top end of the market. That narrow range of products is not going to serve an aging population or meet the demand for more intergenerational living. It's not particularly climate resilient, and it's not setting us up for some unseen future event like a pandemic that's going to scramble how we think about our homes, our offices, our communal spaces, our public streets. I don't want to propose what these more flexible products should look like to meet the future. That is the architecture and design work that many of you will do or that you're already doing. It's the kind of work that's on display across the hall right now. But I'm suggesting that we have to first challenge many of these rules so that you can do that work. In many places, that will mean ending single-family zoning and legalizing accessory dwelling units and more multifamily housing types. It'll mean relaxing the distinctions between commercial and residential districts, or between permanent housing and temporary lodging. In many places, it will mean reconsidering public participation so that it's not just a vehicle for people worried about their property values to say no. Or it means finding ways to defang disingenuous uses of environmental reviews. It also means asking honestly about our rules. Why do we have this? What purpose does it serve? Why does an apartment need a deeper rear yard than a hotel? Why does a furniture store need less parking per square foot than a pawn shop that also sells furniture? If the answer is we don't know, maybe we don't need to have those rules. I've talked about this also with Sarah Bronin, who's an architect and legal expert at Cornell who studies zoning. And she led a complete top to bottom rewrite of the zoning code in Hartford, Connecticut, where they actually did this exercise for real, of going through and asking about everything in there. Does this make sense? Does this serve a larger purpose? And I asked her how she thinks about what kind of overarching logic she should use for what to cut and what to keep. Because some of this is hard and subjective, it's not obvious. And one of the things that she told me is that she pushes people to ask this about their zoning codes. Does the code as a whole promote a sustainable, equitable, vibrant community? If it doesn't, then what can be changed about it? Often the answers in asking that question point to the same type of provisions. Overly homogeneous residential development, zoning code which pushes people to rely on cars, zoning that creates an aesthetically displeasing environment. That standard, I think, speaks to a lot of the examples that I've shown here as well. The pawn shop parking requirement, the rear yard discrepancy, the rock formation setback. They're not doing a lot of work to promote a sustainable, equitable, vibrant community. I would add to that list, though, do your rules, zoning or otherwise, also promote flexibility? Do they preserve our ability to change our minds in the future or to respond to circumstances we can't even envision today, like a global pandemic or sudden shift in the nature of work? What rules would we write and what rules would we cut if we kept flexibility in mind always too? I want to end on something that's a little different from my mostly random charts and maps. This is an illustration that I love from a children's book that I like to read to my 3 city kids. It's from Dominika Lipnius's book, In the City. I highly recommend it. And it has this kind of perfectly urbanist lesson in it, in the language any child could understand, but that many grown-ups don't. Cities grow and change all the time, but people get used to changes very quickly. If I'm feeling sort of cynical, I look at this picture and I think, you can't build any of these buildings in many American communities. That rooftop garden probably isn't allowed. I wonder why that lady right there can't have a bike lane. But I also find this picture a good reminder to think about not just the obstacles that precede change, but what happens afterward. People do live with it. They often decide they like it. Even the guy who sued over the bike lanes gets over it eventually. And the city is doing what it's supposed to do here. It's evolving. It's making room for something or someone new. When I look at this picture, I just think, this is a place that looks flexible. And this is the kind of place that I would like to live in, and that I think a lot of other people would too. So I put my email address there. I really do want you to email me like crazy examples of things. It will help me in my reporting. And I want my editor who's in the office to know that I am also planning to write a version of some of these thoughts in the New York Times one of these days very soon.
Okay.
So if you have questions that would help me workshop how I'm going to do that, I would also love to take any questions or chat about anything else.
So, questions? Plasma.
It's more of a comment. The first house I built was 728 square feet. Okay, and a bank would not mortgage it for my client because they didn't think it was a house. So we had to show how you could add to it. And then finally convince the bank to mortgage it. And because our savings are our mortgages, that's our savings account. This is unusual around the world.
Mhm.
It actually, the banks have a lot, and assessors have a lot of power in driving up the size of the houses. Because it's sort of stretching your savings account. So that's another problem beyond
Yeah.
just the code.
Yeah, that's a great point. There are whole other forms of inflexibility that are built into our financing models of things. I mean, this is a huge problem with accessory dwelling units today. And even in the communities that have legalized them, banks don't know what to do with them. And home builders who want to build them can't find lenders who will finance them because, you know, we've had such a rigid set of housing typologies that lenders don't know what to do with new kinds of things, different kinds of things. That's a great point.
One.
Just wanted to ask,
It's one of our students.
first and foremost, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Very interesting. I was just wondering if you could elaborate more on, how do you like recommend, like, how do you manage flexibility in a status quo of a systemic country that neglects anyone from achieving such said flexibility?
I'm sorry, repeat that one more time.
Yes, so the question is like, how do you manage flexibility in a place and in a country that neglects anyone from achieving such flexibility? And I'm thinking these in the matters of like housing, it's what you're talking about right now, but then it also applies to transportation. And, you know, it's something that I'm not from here, but like living in New York and then visiting other places, it's such a huge, change, drastic change.
Are you thinking about what flexibility looks like in the context of countries outside of the US?
No, like here, like, how do you think that could be managed? How could that be, that flexibility that you started talking about could be achieved
Yeah.
in a place that has so many constraints in other parts and other like roots of its.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I don't think that the ultimate end goal is that we just let anybody build whatever they want, wherever they want. I mean, that doesn't make any sense either. And I'm also not advocating for like, let's just go back to doing everything how we did 100 years ago. Like, we have to have constraints. We especially have to have constraints when 10 million people live in one metro area. I mean, I've sort of gone back and forth between thinking about this as a problem of increasing complexity and thinking about it as a problem of declining flexibility. And to a certain extent, we have to have rising complexity as, you know, people are living in denser environments and more people are living in big cities. So, I mean, I think that's part of what makes this especially challenging is that the answer isn't, you know, this obvious, like, just get rid of all of these rules, but it's about trying to find this right balance between, you know, having the constraints that together support the things we ultimately care about in our communities at the end of the day, but trying to remove the constraints that are preventing us from doing those things. That's not, I feel like this is a completely unsatisfying answer to your question, but it's like, I don't know, this is true about everything. It's a balance, right? And it's gonna look different in New York City from what it looks like in San Francisco, from what it looks like in in LA, but I just fundamentally think most communities are not even having a conversation about whether or not we have enabled enough flexibility to create the things that we want in the future.
Awesome. You have it.
Thank you so much. This was so wonderful, and also capping up a week for some of us thinking about flexibility and inflexibility in terms of the exhibition and the yesterday symposium. But I'm curious, I mean, you talked a lot about zoning and then a little bit about financing. I'm curious how you think about property taxes in this scheme of the thing, especially with respect to local versus state versus national. Like at the local level, the reliance on property taxes that you don't need in certain states, of home rule states for the state and central government to appropriate that money. How do you think about property taxes in terms of the inflexibility of residential building stock?
The first thing that comes to mind for me is to think about California, where the kind of like original sin and a lot of the problems that they have in their housing market is that they have a property tax structure that, sorry, it's okay. You don't need to look at anything. They have a property tax structure that says your property tax rate is fixed to the year when you buy your home. And if you bought your home in 1970, you're going to pay 1970s property taxes for the rest of your life, even if you lived there for 50 years. And it creates this terrible incentive structure where people won't move out of their homes. And you have on a single street, a home that's paying property taxes at a valuation of $2 million right next to a home that's paying a property tax at a valuation of $200,000. And there's this terrible inequity in it, and there's this intergenerational inequity, and it just, prevents turnover from happening in the housing market. And I hadn't thought about it until you mentioned it, but this is also like a perfect example of like a structural thing that we created in the structure of how people pay property taxes in California in particular, that contributes to inflexibility in the housing market entirely. I think it's probably also the case that, when a lot of the challenges, as you've seen in New York in the last week, stem from, the political process and the sort of feedback loop between how people are attached to their housing and their fears about housing values. And, they want their politicians to act in defense of their housing values. And it's this sort of terrible feedback loop that is like the #1 thing that prevents a lot of housing reform and zoning reform from happening. But it's also true that, local and state governments have a vested interest in certain ways of doing things because charging people taxes on housing is part of, how we pay for things. And if you are a local government, it is arguably in your interest for everyone's home value to just keep skyrocketing because you collect more property taxes off of that. And if we built more housing so that everyone's home values weren't always skyrocketing, you wouldn't collect as much taxes per home. I mean, you would probably collect more taxes altogether because there would be more homes, but that's definitely, I'm thinking through this out loud as I'm answering your question, but yeah, I mean, that's a perfect other example of, another point that someone made to me was, if you're an affordable housing developer, the way that you structure the finances of any given project in order to build a building is infinitely more complicated than it was, 30, 40 years ago. You're getting financing from like 15 different places, and each of those programs has a different set of rules, and some of them are federal rules and some of them are state rules, and you have this tiny narrow time in order to pull all the pieces together. And that's in itself just another form of complexity and constraints that's probably also reducing flexibility too.
Laura?
Yes, thank you very much. I really enjoyed your talk. So as you may notice, I'm not a local, but I work in housing and informality in many places. Actually, I work on the other side of the regulations spectrum. And I would like to expand this conversation about what makes the inflexibility, because when I imagine a comparison between the New York regulations and for example, my city, Buenos Aires regulations, I don't think that New York is much more regulated than Buenos Aires. And I wish I could have a comparative study of like regulations across cities in the world, but what I do see is that there is a huge monopolization of who has the right to build. So there is this huge concentration in large developers, even if they build at smaller scale, but there is this huge concentration on who is the actor of development. There is less insurgency from the civil society than in other cities, and there is less political tolerance about what can happen in the city, right? And that is not exclusively a regulation question.
Yeah.
And I tell you this because I have two sets of data. One is like, there is a correlation between the smaller and the more local developer is the riskier and the more innovative.
Mhm.
And second, I studied a lot all my life, these incremental strategies you show. And they are very complicated in high density settings. They, they arise a lot of social conflict. It's very difficult to regulate them. So, I mean, are we overestimating the role of regulation? And we're not talking about power and economic power. And it's like.
Yeah, when I suggested that, a lot of this is formal, but some of it is informal, part of what I'm thinking of is our politics. And, the politics of NIMBYism and, the role that fear of litigation plays. And, those things are not just, they're not rules I can point to in a zoning code. They're like in the ether. They're, your knowledge that I don't want to try to modify my home because I'm going to have to ask my neighbor's permission for it. And so I'm not going to do that. Or, I would build an affordable housing development in this neighborhood, but I know that I'm going to get bogged down in 5 years of environmental impact assessments. So I'm not going to do that. Like there's a bunch of other stuff that's tied into this picture, and that has to do with this sort of changing obsession over time with our property values and with sort of, people becoming like overly invested in housing. I mean, and it's also tied to this much bigger problem we have in America that like we don't give people other forms of wealth building. I totally agree with you that there's a bunch of other stuff that's not a formal rule. It's informal, or it's cultural, it's sociological, it's political, it's not necessarily legal in a sense. Thank you for bringing that up.
Question.
Hi. Thank you for that. Fantastic talk. Let me turn this around and ask you a sort of a backwards question. What kinds of regulation do you see as essential? So if you were in charge, if you were queen, what sorts of issues should the regulation of the built environment focus on?
Yeah, so that's kind of what I was trying to get Sarah Bronin to give me a good answer for, because it's like, okay, if we're going to sort of, go back to first principles, or I hate that phrase, it's like a tech industry phrase, but if we're going to sort of step back and say like, what's most important to us, and let's build up from there, like, what are those things that are most important to us? And I think, many of us would agree that health and safety is a really big part of it. And, some of the things that Sarah mentioned, that we, particularly at this point, we care about sort of sustainability. We care about equity, but then it gets messy and hard, and not everybody's going to agree. Like, do we also want to agree that protecting union labor is an important part of our rulemaking? Do we want to agree that, doing something like racial impact assessments are an important part of what we want to do? Like I gave some like incredibly silly examples, like the rock formation one, which I think is a very obvious no-brainer. Like that's a bad idea. Like, why are we doing that? But there's a bunch of other stuff that's hard and it's nuanced, and I don't want to suggest that that the answer is obvious in all cases. Like I don't know what the right answer is when the unionized hotel workers have interests that may involve not turning hotels into housing. It's a legitimate thing to have political debate about whether or not we want to prioritize that over other goals like, you know, building an affordable housing development, particularly where this given hotel is.
Rosalie, you had a question?
Yes, which, Emily kind of just answered in a way, but they, you know, it's clear, one could say, to see whose interests are being served in a suburban area when people don't, you know, when they want, large lot zoning or something, they're protecting any property values, but the example that you gave about the 30-foot versus 20-foot rear setback. I wonder, I mean, that seems like such a bit of pure irrationality that I wonder what you're thinking is on whose interests are being served by the existence of that, and therefore who insists changing that. I mean,
Yeah.
part of the answer, I guess, is that it's the hotel workers don't want things. They wouldn't have probably chosen that as the mechanism to prevent change, but. So the flip side of this question is, if we want to change arcane things like that and have a 50-page instead of a 1,200-page zoning code, how would you go about that? Whose interests would you? And what interests do we have to kind of take on to do that?
Yeah, I mean, to do that, you have to have a political process, right? Where you're still involving people and people are sort of arguing about the relative merits of doing different things. I mean, public policy is always about a trade-off. I mean, even things we think of as like universally good, like environmental protection, there's trade-offs inherent in that, like making construction more expensive or making projects take longer. And so there still has to be some like messy political wrangling and public dialogue about like which things do we want to prioritize. I'm not convinced though that like that all of the kludge has a special interest. Like, I don't know, the parking requirements for pawn shops or whatever. I don't think that like the pawn shop lobby cares about like making sure that they have enough parking or anything like that. I mean, I just think that like some of this stuff, like someone thought it was a good idea at one point. Someone thought it was wise policy. You know, someone thought we want to make sure that we're reducing traffic and people aren't double parking. And so we want to ensure that there's enough parking everywhere. And so I'm not sure that like everything you would want to go through with a line item and get rid of or rethink, that like there would be a, you know, some voice would like come out of a closet and start advocating for that thing. Some of it I just think is like, it's just sort of built up, calcified, leftover stuff from some previous way of thinking about things. And maybe we could get rid of some of those things without fighting about it. That's definitely not going to be true for all of this stuff or even a lot of it, but I think that's true for some of it.
Yeah, I just wonder why we're so inert about it. I mean, why can't we do it? Because we seem unable to do that.
I mean, there's definitely like sort of big picture narratives and themes over time, like the protection of property values, like that is animating a lot of it. The protection of road space for cars is animating a lot of it. And if you sort of, work backwards and try to figure out why do we have some of these rules, like you're going to wind up with those two answers a lot of the times, I think. But yeah, I don't know. That's a good question. I haven't like the rock formation thing. I have no idea who benefits from that.
A question? Yeah.
I have a question specifically about converting office space to residential. And I have two questions that came from a conversation with someone involved in San Francisco development. The first one, and I don't know if it's true, but he said it's much more difficult to convert newer commercial and office buildings to residential. And I was in that conversation. And so what happens to some of the newer things when the vacancy rates are so high for commercial office space, and then actually they can't service debt, investors, developers, banks repossess, in the context of that bank inflexibility, when they want corporate anchor tenants, it seems like banks are gonna have to be a little more adaptable, or else we're just gonna have these ghost office buildings in some parts of cities.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely the case, not just in San Francisco, but everywhere, that newer buildings are, in many ways, they're harder because they're just giant. They're big, and because they're so big, they have all of this interior space that's nowhere near a window where you just can't put an apartment. That's why you know, these developers in the financial district are cutting giant holes out of the interior buildings. You know, we didn't build like absolutely massive office buildings that had like 50,000 square foot per floor in the 1920s. So that's part of it. But the other, I mean, another thing that I sort of came across in my reporting on this is that, like in California, for instance, converting a lot of those buildings is going to be just impossible, because the seismic requirements that you have to meet in a residential building are different than they are for an office building, because we have this idea that, like, if people are going to be sleeping in the building, we need to maybe offer them a different level of protection than if they're going to be working in the building. And when I first heard that, I was like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then I was talking to Ingrid Ellen about it, and I was like, yeah, I learned this thing. And she's like, well, does that make sense? Like, why, you know, if you're going to spend, like, you know, these 10 hours instead of these 10 hours, like 10 hours of nighttime instead of 10 hours of daytime, like, should we be like requiring totally different, you know, I don't know the engineering terms for like supporting a building should an earthquake happen, but yeah, that was sort of like a helpful example for me to be like, oh, even things I thought maybe made sense at first, if you step back and you're like, does it make sense for us to be like distinguishing between buildings in this way? I don't know, but that's probably something that's also gonna, you know, come up in California a lot.
The question about.
It's a little bit, it's me.
There's some students. Can we hear from some students? Yeah, sure. I'm sorry, I don't know your name. Red hair. You, yes.
So I was actually wondering what type of, like, because I know policy in other countries might not be perfect, but is there an example of something you think that is working currently that allows such flexibility? Because I know, like, in certain places, Japan, they have concepts of building that allows a more community-based type of construction, but I wonder if you know any other type of places that have policy that is working.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I will admit that I report almost entirely about the US. But Japan was the place I would have suggested to you. I mean, Japan just comes up like again and again and again as like, you know, if we, you know, if we viewed housing as this sort of like disposable thing that you live in and it provides you shelter, and maybe in 40 years, you know, we'll just build more of it or replace it. I mean, it's just a totally different conception of the function that housing should serve. You know, and I think in general, other parts of the world where it's, you know, it's where there's a lower ownership rate and people are sort of less obsessed with the idea that like a renter is just someone who hasn't become a homeowner yet, and we're all like striving to attain that eventually. I think that those would be places that I would look as well, but I have to admit that I've never like dug into the zoning code of a particular town in Japan or Germany or other places. But that's invariably the answers to our problems in America, that we should be looking at other countries.
Can take one or two more questions? Yes, students. Right.
You know, when you open up architectural digest and you read what the architects have to say, they never talk about zoning, or I don't see it very often. They like to kind of brag about how beautiful their building looks. I feel like the culture of architecture is super formal. It's all about the building looks like, and about how it fits into the urban fabric that surrounds it. And I'm wondering, you know, I think that the culture of architecture has a major role to play in the changes that need to happen here, because these are structural and cultural problems. So who can architects partner with to build a coalition to change these policies? And how can we make it?
Yeah, I mean, that's a fantastic question. I mean, it sounds like it sounds like sort of half of that work is about sort of, you know, changing the culture within your own profession, but the other half of that work is about sort of, you know, going outside of the profession and interacting with and being part of these conversations. I mean, there's part of what I find very interesting about like pushes for reforming zoning or, you know, trying to build more abundant housing, as we call it, is it's a really kind of interesting, eclectic group of interests that are sort of coming together around the idea that like some of the stuff that I've been describing is a problem. And so, you know, it's some of it is sort of familiar housing advocacy groups, but it's also, and this is going to sound weird, but like in Silicon Valley, it's tech companies that have been advocating for trying to reform the housing market because prior to the pandemic and remote work, like they are having a hard time hiring people because no one wants to move to California and pay California housing prices, even if you make tech money. So there's also some kind of interesting, strange bedfellows politically who are involved in these conversations because, you know, libertarians on the far right think, you know, we're limiting people's property rights that they have in their own homes by telling them that they can't build things on their own property. If you tell people you can't have an ADU, you're like limiting my ability to do what I want with my own property. So there's, you know, there's like libertarians at the table, there's tech people at the table, there's, you know, sort of more familiar kind of liberal advocacy groups who, you know, care about affordable housing and low income communities who are at the table. I mean, it's still obviously like the other table has a lot of homeowners at it and it's a much bigger table. But it's a coalition that's growing and I would feel like encouraged about that. And I think for architects to be, you know, a big part of that would be a big deal.
We can take one more question. Yes, in the back there.
First of all, thank you for the presentation. It's so interesting. I'm curious what you think is the future of New York and other American urban cities. There seems to be a trend right now, post-COVID, even though we kind of recognize that office space needs revival. There's this big trend from big corporations to create like mega fancy office spaces, like the new Chase headquarters are being built. And that seems like a very superficial answer. So I'm curious, how do you think we can, in a post-COVID world, move away from these superficial office spaces to create a more public, secure city?
I think in general, oftentimes when stuff is hard, like you have to have like a crisis in order for people to want to do something about it. And it's sort of alarming that the pandemic wasn't that thing. And, you know, the sort of insane things we saw happen in the housing market and with rent increases and just the way the housing crisis is spread and that homelessness is spreading, like that hasn't happened yet. But, you know, sort of given like the economic incentive structures, when cities start really losing commercial property taxes, like that is a crisis that gets people's attention.
And that is happening.
And that is happening, and it's probably going to get worse. You know, if your housing becomes so expensive that, you know, more and more people move away, like that is potentially a crisis that starts to get people's attention. I mean, I also just sort of generally find in writing about the housing market in particular that like problems that have been affecting low-income people for a long time, we finally start hearing about them politically when they impact middle-class people or even higher-income people, and increasingly those things are going to happen. So this, I guess, this is like a very grim answer to your question. Like, wait for a crisis, or wait for things. I don't know. Things will get worse before they get better. I probably wouldn't have said that like 2 weeks ago, but after like what's happening in with housing policy in the state of New York and the state legislature, I'll say that now.
Yeah. Okay, I think we need to say thank you to Emily. Glad we put your.
Not, it sounds like